Welcome, everybody, to Gazelli Art House. We're very, very excited that you're able to join us. Tonight, we are having a Tuesday talk in conjunction with our current show, which is a group show called Let's Talk About Text. The show is a sort of seemingly disparate group of different visual artists that use text in their work. But one of the things we want to talk about, and one of the things that connects all the different artists in the show, is this idea of activating or describing networks. We are extremely delighted to present our three panelists. First off, joining us all the way from New York City is Saul Ostrow. Saul is a critic, artist, and curator, and founder of the Critical Institute, an organization that fosters research, teaching, and practice dedicated to social justice and change. I mean, alongside a hugely illustrious career, he's also arts editor and founder of Bomb magazine.
Not founder.
Oh, not founder. Okay. My mistake. But Saul is also
That's what would kill me.
Yeah, don't worry. Arts editor of Bob magazine. And also, Saul has very kindly worked with us to bring to contribute a big correspondence between him and an artist who features in the show called Ray Johnson. So we're delighted that Saul, you were able to contribute that material. It's really kind. Thank you very much for that. Also, we're joined all the way from sunny Ramsgate is Bob Roberta Smith, a British contemporary artist, writer, author, musician, and arts education advocate. Again, alongside having a long and varied career as a visual artist, he's also been the curator of many different public art projects. For example, a project he did called Art You Need. He created the Art Party in 2013 to promote contemporary art advocacy. And he's just finished a 2-year project called the Thamesmead Codex, which is supported by the Tate and in conjunction with a community in Thamesmead. And last but not least, also, we're delighted to welcome Eve Kalyva, an art critic, museum educator, and writer. Eve comes from an interdisciplinary educational background and completed her PhD on image and text relations in conceptual art. She has undertaken research and teaching at the University of Leeds, Buenos Aires, and Amsterdam, and has collaborated with international art institutions such as the Henry Moore Institute as a curator and the Museum of Modern Art Chile as an artist in residence. Her monograph, Text and Image and Text in Conceptual Art, Critical Operations in Context, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. So welcome everyone for that sort of rather epic introduction. We have an epic panel, so that's going to take a bit of time to get through everyone's achievements and address everyone properly. First of all, I'd like to begin kicking things off really by talking to Saul and to talk a bit about the New York Correspondence School. So what the sort of discussion tonight is loosely around how visual artists activate networks, or either within their own sort of cultural communities or beyond the art world into sort of wider communities, and how visual art and language affect those changes and affect those kind of networks and how that works. So Saul, I wonder if you could start things off by talking to us a bit about Ray Johnson and the New York Correspondence School. That'd be great.
Yeah. No. As you and I originally chatted, what happens is the New York Correspondence School, part of Ray's production, gets lost in its sort of generic heading of mail art, and most people don't realize that all of this correspondence that circulated was part of this networking that Ray had set out to construct. And I haven't confirmed this because I haven't done the research, but I've always assumed that New York Correspondence School was a sort of joke about the New York School, which was the abstract expressionist generation that preceded him. and that by this point, you didn't have to be present. You could just, by surrogate, be present in and exchange information, exchange news, so on and so forth. A lot of people don't realize the correspondence school actually had meetings. Ray would occasionally send out an invitation and tell you that at Finch College, we were going to gather. And basically, it was people coming together, a lot of people reporting what they were working on, but for the most part, socializing. People meeting people. It was an opportunity for people to meet people. How you became a member of the New York Correspondence School is still a mystery. I think that almost everybody who ended up being elected and nominated by Ray solely. So my connection to Ray was I was a student. I heard about him. I sent him a request for a mailing tag, and instead I got back a letter. And slowly over 4 or 5 year period, it evolved, and the next thing I knew was, listed among the members of the correspondence. I was listed among the members of the correspondence school with other people who at that time weren't famous, but were on their way to being famous. Various critics, other artists, and so on.
So just to add a bit of context, and this was around the mid to late 60s.
This is, I think the correspondence school actually starts in '64. I'm in touch with Ray about 65, 66, and it sort of runs until 74.
And
or at least that's when I stopped getting mail from.
Yeah.
And within that, Ray, at one point, Ray moves out of New York City to his house on Long Island, which is called 100 Swans.
And so you were talking about the context of the sort of the New York school and how this was a kind of a way of like usurping that or making a comment about that. Was before the New York Correspondence School came along, was the context of that visual art scene in New York very different? Was it a reaction against a particular scene, or what was
the abstract expressionists had the artist club, in which they had meetings and panels and things like that, and networked. About the same time that Ray's doing the New York Correspondence School, Fluxus is coming together. So you've got George McCunis sort of gathering together a bunch of people who would have normally been called neo-Dadaists, but under his tutelage becomes Fluxus. What's of interest and what doesn't get written into the history is that there's this sort of 10-year period between the decline of abstract expressionism and the emergence of pop, in which you have lots of activities, a lot of them under the heading of neo-Dada. You've got all sorts, it's like 100 schools contending for who's going to fill the next historical niche. And you've got a sort of second generation of abstract expressionists who, at least in my opinion, hopefully nobody represents any of them, are disastrous and are going no place. And a lot of these artists are trying to find a way out of that.
So what are you talking about in particular? I mean,
as I said, Fluxus, you've got Rauschenberg and Johns, and who are not at that time considered pop artists, they're considered neo-Dadaists. You've got people like Boris Laurie and the no art movement. You've got an art scene that's on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is sort of beat, connected to the beat generation. you've got Aldo Tambellini with his storefront theater showing independent film and doing early performance and happenings and multimedia presentations. You just got this mash together that seemingly everybody's trying to make their own sense of. And the reason was hyper aware of it was I was an art student and trying to figure out where to locate myself.
And did you find a sort of home in that scene with Ray then?
Eventually, the initial work that I made was I was sort of first generation conceptual artist, coming out of the language end of conceptual art. And the stuff that I was doing was a hybrid because some of it was Fluxus influenced, some of it was influenced by Ray, and others by art and language and Joseph Kassuth.
I can't help feeling there's a connection between your experience of, collaborating with Ray or sending Ray stuff and him sending stuff back to you, and the emergence of Bomb magazine. Do you think it's fair to say there was some sort of cross influence there? What was happening with Bomb magazine that was kind of
Bomb comes later. Bomb comes in the 80s, and once again, it comes out of a Lower East Side scene in which you've got the first generation that will eventually get called postmodernists, people like Ross Bleckner and Eric Fischel and April Gornick and people like that, sitting around bitching and moaning about how they can't get into art form. So it's like, let's start our own magazine. Betsy, you want to start a magazine?
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, Bomb started with about $1,500 from a bunch of artists had sort of chipped in and said, can we do it on this? And everybody thought that Bomb would be one issue, two at the most. 40 years later, I forget what issues we're up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I find interesting about the New York Correspondence School is this idea of collaboration as opposed to sort of competing with each other. I mean, I wonder whether one of the things that kind of resonated with other artists was a way of kind of like sharing ideas, creating a network, figuring out your own scene, and sort of creating this kind of scene for yourselves, which is very different to how the commercial art world certainly operates today, that's for sure.
Well, once again, at that time, well into the 60s, not until the early 70s, there was the art world, which was this, the uptown, at least in New York, the uptown galleries, very established, so on and so forth. And then you had 10th Street in New York, which was a bunch of co-op galleries organized by artists because they couldn't get into commercial galleries. You had a bunch of artists or failed writers who decided to become art dealers and basically would show the circle of people around them, Dick Bellamy being a prime example of that. And you had the remains of 10th Street, which was the second generation galleries. But money doesn't come into the young end of the art world until the 70s, and that when you begin to get where, at least in New York, you begin to get more speculative collectors.
One of the things I find quite surprising about Ray Johnson and his relationship with the New York Correspondence School is that he seems to come across as an artist who's very much in his own world, sort of an isolated figure almost. Like his kind of work he seems to kind of create his own world and kind of forge his own way in the art world on his own terms. So this idea of sort of collaboration and networks
Well,
seems
you've got two Ray Johnsons. You got this Ray Johnson who's sitting in his loft in downtown Manhattan making collages that, if anybody's seen how to draw a rabbit, Richard Feigen spends 10 years trying to convince him. I think it's 10 years, Richard says, that trying to convince Ray to show his collages, which is what Ray considers personal to a degree. And then on the other hand, all this work, endless production of Xerox images, so on and so forth, that are for public circulation. And I think that's schizophrenia in a funny way. It is very, very much the art world of the 60s in New York.
Interesting. I just want to bring in. Thanks for that, Saul. I just want to bring in Bob, if you're able to talk a bit about your current projects. I know that one of the things that seems to have been consistent throughout your artistic journey is this idea of connecting with people and sort of creating these networks, not necessarily of artists, like in Ray Johnson's case, but outside of the art world. One of your slogans is make your own damn art. And one of these ideas is that everyone should make their own art and everyone is an artist in their own right. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the project at Thamesmead and how that might be an example of creating these sort of networks within a community.
Yeah, Saul's talk about Ray Johnson threw up lots of things for me. But yeah, thinking about Thamesmead, well, Thamesmead is a 1960s utopian vision constructed, kind of concrete, brutalist, modernist idea of how people would live in the future. It's a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes from the Second World War, and it looks great, but it was hell for people to live in, and has, I think, been a bit of a disaster. It also has one of Britain's most top security prisons right in the middle of it. So it doesn't all go well for social, flowering, and now it's being but it's a fantastic kind of place, and it is really crazily visionary in terms of its architectural ideas. But it's miles away from work, a long way away from any transport, and people are rather marooned there. And of course, I found it very interesting because it relates a little bit to the green telephone that you've got in the gallery. Because I've grown up as a post-war child. I went to a school that was designed by the German emigre Goldfinger, who designed the Trellick Tower. It was one of his early buildings, Brandle House School. It wasn't quite as brutalist as Thamesmead. But then I went to a large comprehensive school, which has now been demolished. My father he ran Chelsea School of Art. Behind me, I'm painting his office at Chelsea School of Art, where he had a large Rietveld chair and Matisse, Lescargo, and a Toulouse-Lautrec print. That building, which was built in 1963, the year that I was born, it was demolished about 10 years ago. And so all of these phoenix rising from the ashes, like Thamesmead, these architectural constructions are being torn down, pulled apart, and rethought. And so the project comes about because of this moment where Thamesmead is being rethought in a contemporary planners and architects remodeling, really. And I suppose the question is, what about what about the people who live there? And so I interviewed 22 people, some who were there from the outset, some who have moved there later on, and then I've turned those. There's quite a process to do. I interviewed them for about half an hour, then I transcribed the interviews by hand, and then I wrote the interviews. I didn't substitute any words or rewrite them in any way, but I did reconstruct them a little bit so that they fitted onto meter square panels. And then I painted some images of Thamesmead and presented. They're actually in print Thamesmead at the moment, and the idea is that they will then go and be exhibited at Tate Modern. And I think it's a bit of a Trojan horse, this project, really, because what I'm trying to do is to get these voices into the citadel of modernism and have them nailed on the walls of Tate Modern. That's what I'm hoping to achieve with it, where all these people, they're not critical of modernism as an idea, but they are talking about that condition, this condition, and of course it is a critical thing. So that's what that project was about, and it is kind of, that is generating a network. It's dependent on certain networks, but I'm fascinated by the idea of networks. I mean, I think when Saul was talking, I was reminded of somebody who was very important in London when I was sort of starting out, which much later, the 1990s, was Matthew Higgs, who now runs White Columns in New York. But Matthew's first enterprise was this thing called Imprint, where he worked in an architect's office and had free access to a photocopier. And he just made books with Peter Doig and Chris Ofili, and I mean lots of artists, not necessarily the uber YBAs, but the kind of next tranche of people who are coming.
Hello, man. Thanks ever so much for holding. So yes.
And I was sort of I did one of those books with him. So did my wife, and that story of kind of mutual support, I think, is important in the whole story of kind of art making. There has to be in a way, like Matthew Higgs, in a sense, is perhaps overblowing it a bit, but he was a kind of Apollinaire figure, constructing a kind of world and a context for us to operate in much the same way I imagine Ray Johnson was for Saul and all those people interested in language and text at that time.
Yeah. I wonder whether those kinds of like idealistic notions of communities of artists that help each other will never truly work out in the same way that the Thamesmead estate is stuffed full of asbestos and must be demolished immediately, despite the good meaning of those people that are involved in activating those kind of networks. I wonder if we could talk to Eve, actually. Well, can you hear us, Eve? Are you there?
Yeah.
Now, I know that you've done lots of work and written lots about the relationship between sort of visual art and text. And just talking a bit about kind of like networks, and perhaps if you're able to talk a bit about how there's a precarious nature to those networks as well, and we can have a sort of, optimistic vision of how the world should be. What are some of the challenges of trying to follow through with those ideas?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? Because, hearing the discussion so far, yes, it's really important. Communication is really important. Networks is really important. Getting out of the gallery as a privileged space, elite, whatever space is important. And what you said about networks between artists, but also between communities, and how, those networks form communities. And then, of course, the question is how you sustain that, isn't it? So I was thinking, hearing everyone talking so far, I think we talked a bit about different platforms through which you can establish those networks. So the idea of Ray Johnson's mail art, which is, by the way, is very interesting because he wouldn't just mail things out, right? He would also give instructions, send this to this, do this. So it would be an expansive network that would be decentralized. It wouldn't just be the artist as the initiator. Then we also have, the magazine as a platform for site-specific works as a platform, or the book as well as platforms for networks. And then the question is how these are maintained and how these are circulated. And I think one of the ways to do that is to keep the discussion going. So if networks are produced through reaching out to people, through co-creation, through participation, they should remain open, right? So say it starts from the gallery and then it goes out to a magazine and it goes out to a mailing list and it goes out to community, then it should somehow, the structure of it, the nature of it, the same way Ray Johnson did his letters. So the very structure of the project should enable this continuity, right? So it shouldn't be like a closed off thing that reflects the intention of the artist and that's it. And I think that's the one. So in terms of structure, and I think the other way to maintain communities is precisely to address those issues, right? To address the issue of communication, to address the issue of the commons, we're all in this together, not just doing things as a group, but through various activities, but bringing in or reflecting those activities the ideas of exchange, dialogue, respect, thinking about the future in a more common way. And I think the exhibition, I mean, you did say, yes, it's different artists, different interests, but as you said, networks is one of the threads, the links between the artworks. And also I think this idea of thinking together with the other, right?
So you've written a lot about the relationship between the visual arts world and text in particular. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the differences between artists really using text in that kind of like progressive or forthright way, and how that is kind of a fundamental, it sounds like a stupid question really, but a kind of like a fundamental component for creating an artwork that has that's about engaging people in a sort of direct way.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think I've been struggling with this question as well, because as you say, like I specialize in conceptual art, which was historical, specific historical moments that things happen. And I think the easy way to go about answering your question is to think about whether the artwork you're creating is meant to be, who is the audience? Let's put it that way. So the question is, who is the audience? Is your artwork meant to be challenging the art world, the establishment, the premises of modernism? This is a hardcore, let's say, conceptual artist who introduced art language in a visual art context precisely to break this idea of the color, form, modernist tools of doing art. So is the audience of the artistic creation meant to be the art world? Then we're going to break that challenge, etc. Or is it certain communities, people, and through the networks you just described? And I think if it's the latter, then then in many cases you don't have this preoccupation with thinking outside the box in terms of tools and languages and how to phrase something, but you're really addressing your communities, and you're a bit more flexible in terms of the tools you're gonna use. Yeah.
Cool. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Eve. Thank you for that. So one of the ways you described Moll magazine was about a group of artists that couldn't get into the art forum. And I wonder whether the intentions of Bob Magazine, I'm moving away from Ray Johnson here a little bit.
Yeah.
But if there were intentions of Bob Magazine to kind of reach an audience beyond the art world, if you like, in the same way, in a similar way that Ray was trying to connect artists together. Was that an intention for you? How does it work when you've got a publication like Bob Magazine? You're trying to reach a wide audience, a community, trying to activate a broader community, or is it more about, you know, writing for a very specific art audience?
Well, one has to remember the model for Bob Magazine was an interview magazine, Andy Warhol's interview. The whole idea was that people, that rather than writing about people, people should have a chance to speak for themselves. So Bob doesn't, well, now it's bits and pieces online, it'll do criticism, but Bob didn't have any criticism. It was either a writer or a poet's work, or an artist interviewing an artist, or an artist interviewing somebody that they found interesting. So it was very much about giving voice. As I said, the original audience for it was unimagined. It was like, well, do it. Somebody will find it. There was a very important bookstore in New York called St. Mark's Bookstore, where Baum was among all the other magazines like Metropolis and so on that were being published, oversized magazines that were being published at the time, because newsprint was cheap, and nobody was actually thinking anything would last for more than an issue or two. What Baum ended up doing, actually, in an interesting way, was bringing literary and visual artists and literary people together, and still does. Baum also now does a lot of live readings and things like that, because it still believes that there's a community, and that community needs to be served. And so far, Betsy's been very successful at sustaining the magazine so it can serve that community.
That's super interesting, Bob. I want to bring you in on this a little bit. So your experience of you've put together some, like recently, there's been several of your projects seem to have been about art in the public realm, art for the public, which again is kind of a thing about activating networks in a way and activating communities. And I was just wanted to ask you, like, in what ways you are able to hold on to control of a project, knowing that there's elements that are kind of like beyond what will happen or that are unexpected, and how you kind of deal with that as an artist, where you might have an intention for a work to activate a community in a certain way, but actually they might react in a completely different way. And is that like disappointing, or is that like okay, or what's been your experience of working in that way?
I think the whole activity is quite unified, really, and I'm thinking about this idea about the relationship between text and conceptualism, really. And I suppose when I lived in New York in the end of the 80s, and I got introduced to actually, it was a Chelsea School of Art originally, but it was an amazing librarian called Clive Philpott at the Museum of Modern Art, and he is a absolute Fluxus junkie and a Ray Johnson junkie, and so he introduced me to this world which I didn't know, and but it had resonance with it had resonances with me because I'm of the generation where we loved Jamie Reed, and we went to the anti-racist marches, which were the typography was very important, designed in part by a guy called Roger Huddle, and it was about, so this is kind of collision between, you know, a much more graphic design approach, but kind of with Jamie Reed, you've kind of got fluxus in a spin, you know, and that was very exciting to me. And then more recently, looking at people like Sister Karita Kent, well, her community is a religious community. It started off, then it was the civil rights community, and now the art world has only just caught up with her. You know, I mean, she was there, and I sort of think actually that people like Lawrence Rena and Joseph Kossuth, and you know, people who are seen as perhaps more kind of, they're not obscure figures at all, but talking in a kind of a slightly more rarefied language. I suspect that they want to be Sister Karita Kent. I suspect that I suspect that they want to talk directly to their audiences, to avoid the museum in a way, to avoid the art world, just like Bomb magazine and just like being in the St. Mark's bookshop. You know, the joy of that is that although you're at the mercy of the market and real life, you're not at the mercy of all the gatekeepers and the oligarchs' children, you know. And I think there's something probably with lots of artists who use text where they want to be critical of graphic design, of course they do, but they also love it, you know, and they want to talk directly to people and touch nerves, you know. I don't know what other people think about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Eve, do you think those more sort of highbrow artists using text are trying to avoid the museum system? Is that sort of like, is that a bit of a fallacy?
No, I do agree. I think there is definitely a distinction to make there between what Bob said about, you know, the graphic design, how the artwork looks, the kind of font type you use, the kind of format, whatever, and an interest in moving away and entering new aesthetic forms. So it doesn't, because there has been a very big discussion around, you know, the use of language and whether it breaks away with the, you know, aesthetic interest, or we don't care about how things look visually because we break visuality with the textual. But this is not to say that, you know, as an artist, you're not making specific choices how and how you want to present something. So there's definitely a lot of discussion about the making of conceptual art, near-conceptual art, artists who use text from a very specific theoretical viewpoint that has to do with, you know, ontology and aesthetics and, you know, heavyweight lifting for theory. And then, you know, wake-up call from reality. When you make work, yes, you can have these theoretical debates in your mind, but you also make specific choices, you have specific interests. So I think definitely there has been this interest to challenge and criticize and move out of the art world, etc. But there also have been other interests in that. And I think it's important to be able to distinguish the different arguments that come in play, and where those arguments come from, because, you know, as art historians, as art critics, we can introduce lots of theory into something, but that doesn't mean that it originated from the artist. You see what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's very that's a very pertinent point. I know that the talk has been slightly sort of broad and a little bit rambling, but we've from our own different positions we're able to find these kind of connections that actually link together some of the ideas that we've been talking about. And I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time, so I'm wondering if we're able to open up this if any of the attendees have questions that they'd like to ask the panelists. We've skirted around and sort of gone into lots of different issues, really. But if anyone would like to contribute a question, you can do so by entering the chat.
I think there's a lot of questions come out of the conversation actually about language that's thrown up by Ray Johnson, because he's such an enigmatic figure, isn't he? I don't really know what happened to him at the end, and that sense of control and him being an outsider in that world. And I wonder whether Saul had any reflections on Ray Johnson, who he thought his art was for, who he thought, if we thought Bomb magazine is finding its audience by being made, what was Ray Johnson? Who was he talking to?
I think, once again, one forgets, and as I said, it's somewhat schizophrenic. Ray Johnson is a product of Black Mountain School. He was there at the same time as Rauschenberg and people like that. There's that circulation. He's a collagist. Somehow, mail art became the public face of it. And, we forget that there's huge mail art networks that is still operable all around the world. They're just not highly visible. It's a conspiracy that manages itself. Ray, and you can take a look in a funny way at Ray's collages to get an idea that he's fascinated by popular culture. To a certain degree, he thinks Warhol's his audience. And that lots of works are addressed to him, so on and so forth, or comment on Warhol. He's part of at that time the gay art world. His close friends are people like Paul Tech and Peter Hujar. So you've got it can't become even two-dimensional. It actually becomes multi-dimensional. And if you take a look at lists of people who he identifies with New York Correspondence School, it's really broad in that he's in a funny way a populist on one hand and an elitist snob on the other, in which there's that which is precious to him, and then there's all these Xerox things that are just produced endlessly. We don't know how many there are. Seemingly a lot of the material I have is rare because everybody else threw it away. Because it was like, what am I? Nice. Next month I'll get another one. Sort of attitude. So, and it has a lot to do with how different the art world of 50 years ago and the art world of today is.
I'm really interested in how the argument about, or the thought about the networks. A lot of the things that Matthew Higgs did, and a lot of the things that I was doing in the early 90s, then became passé, really, because of the internet. And the internet created all these social platforms, created these spaces where people could write something and stick it up on the wall, and then somebody else would see it. And all of that, really, that became those mannerisms really became adopted by the internet. But the key thing I think that you said was that it was actually about meeting. Mail art was actually about, and that's where we go wrong if we rely completely on social media.
He would, and the meeting was literally, the invitation was literally just for you. I actually at one point sent him a note asking if he could invite a friend of mine, and he said, "This is not a happening. This isn't a party." No.
Really kind of a little bit of a sort of remedial question here, actually, but it's kind of, I've been wondering this myself. Someone asked, can you go into the meaning of the bunny symbolism in Ray's work? So one of the repeated motifs was this sort of cartoon bunnies. It was like a brand. It was almost like a sort of like a logo or something in Ray's work.
At least at the time, and even if you see the film, it's a self-portrait.
Right.
He likes to, and also, he produces this other character, which is the sort of universal character that has a long sort of elephantine nose and wiggly ears and bulging eyes, and everybody's name goes underneath one of those. But I assumed Ray was always the rabbit, and then one can go about decoding that however one wants to. But the other important thing to remember, and is this is the period of the beginnings of telecommunications. It's the period of McLuhan. It's and I think also relative to Ray's correspondence school material, it's the period of concrete poetry and visual poetry. A lot of artists are around the Lower East Side. Poets like Ed Sand, even Warhol is among the poets on the Lower East Side early on, before when he first starts out. The world was much more integrated in its own peculiar way at that time.
Can I add something to that? Sorry, George. I think that's very good point. And I think another parallel we can make as well in terms of context, in terms of understanding the cultural context, to go back to what you said about the New York school and all that, artist persona and macho heavyweight lifting testosterone, the artist persona celebrated. And I think Ray Johnson really plays out the idea of the identity of the artist, and is trying to make introduce a lighter touch, let's say, to all that. The cult of the artist, or the what's the other word I'm looking for here? I wouldn't say consumerism, but that's a parallel discussion. But yeah, definitely in terms of the cult of the artist and the celebration of the artist genius, let's say. And I think he's trying through his work as well to try to divert away from that. And I think the bunny persona as a self-portrait could speak to that parallel.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the other questions that we had was if mail art could kind of make a resurgence or exist today in our sort of social media drenched culture, whether there is space for a return to kind of exchanging physical things.
It never went away. It's out there, and there's, if you follow, Matthew Higgs would know this better than I do, in that, the world of Buster Cleveland and Orworks and endless artists who were exchanging small publications, all sorts of things. It's been going, steady since the early '60s, because and they're short-lived and long-term. There's mail art exchanges, in which it's very limited. I send you a work of art with the instructions to send a work of art onto to so and so, and you then give that person, and that plays itself out or extends itself. But in terms of coming out of more so coming out of the Fluxus group, there's huge not networks of people producing stamps, sheets of stamps, things like that, and exchanging those, and Xerox, once, to a great extent, computer and the internet hasn't killed it.
Printed matter's alive and well.
And the biggest quarters they've ever been in.
And zines, people are really into zines, aren't they? My daughter studied graphic design at Central St Martin's, and my God, they're producing all these risograph zines.
Yep.
And people are really into that. I think you're right. It's alive and well. The younger generation, I think they prize the physical. They're into records, 45s and albums, and they're into zines and printed matter. It's a strange thing, but it's true.
No, unlike Ray and the New York Correspondence School and the mail art of the '60s, it hasn't yet been fetishized, or it started off fetishized, and it does, and you can't get much beyond the fetish of a zine.
I was gonna say, yeah, that's the other direction, yeah, like fetishizing the object and the value of the specific artwork, and of course you're trying to challenge that through mail art or zines or whatever. But then there's always a counter movement, isn't it? Collecting, numbering, making sure that specific object has an added value. So there's two
exactly.
Yeah. Competing forces there, yeah.
Cool. Well, we're just coming up to the hour. I think unless anyone's got any more questions, I think we may wrap things up. I just want to thank you guys very much indeed for joining us. I appreciate taking up your time. You can come and see the show, 39 Dover Street.
I had one last question, George.
Yeah, please.
What's happening on Thursday?
Good question. Well, join us in the space and online for a live gig with the Apathy Band and a certain artist in the show called Bob Roberta Smith, who are live and demonstrating how artistic networks can fail miserably and create mess. I'm just kidding. So yeah, the Apathy Band is a sort of a project with some noise band, and it's actually a kind of a demonstration of how artistic networks can be really playful and fun and exciting. And so the gig is next Thursday. Get to the gallery at 6 p.m. Best to kind of get in touch with us first, because we have a limited amount of space due to COVID restrictions. But yeah, this coming Thursday, the 1st of July, please do come and check out the gig. And yeah, thanks all of you guys for taking part. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Lovely.
Thank you for organizing this. It was great fun.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Good meeting you.
Yeah, we're all connected now, so we'll send each other collages.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.